Tease for The Echo of Regret. 10 years ago, Richard Graham walked away from his family, chasing wealth and ambition, leaving his pregnant wife, Emma, with nothing but a note. Now a successful businessman but emotionally hollow, a chance encounter at an airport reveals the life he left behind, a life that includes a son he never knew existed. Determined to make things right, Richard follows Emma and her son to Chicago, only to find that the years of abandonment have left deep scars. Emma has built a new life with James and found love again with a kind-hearted man named Ben. But as Richard tries to reconnect with his son, he discovers that some mistakes are harder to fix than others. Complicating matters is Vanessa, Richard's current wife, who refuses to let him go without a fight, threatening to drag him into a web of deceit and ruin any hope of redemption. As his wealth and empire crumble, Richard must decide. Will he sacrifice everything he built for the chance to be the father he never was, or will he lose the last opportunity to reclaim the family he abandoned? The Echo of Regret is a gripping journey of love, loss, and the fight for a second chance. Can Richard find redemption, or has he lost the most valuable things in life forever? The airport was bustling with the usual Friday morning chaos as Richard Graham glanced at his gold watch for the third time in 10 minutes. He sighed. Another business trip, another deal, another day that felt exactly like the one before. Dressed in an impeccable suit, Richard should have felt a sense of pride, but all he felt was emptiness. As he weaved his way through the crowd, something, or rather, someone, caught his eye. A woman with brown hair walked past him, holding the hand of a young boy. The sight made Richard freeze. "Emma?" he whispered, disbelief washing over him. His ex-wife, Emma, was the last person he expected to see, and yet there she was. Then his gaze shifted to the boy, and his heart nearly stopped. The child's green eyes and unruly blonde hair were unmistakable. He looked exactly like Richard did when he was that age. "No," Richard muttered, stepping closer, desperate to see them again. But just as he tried to follow, the crowd swallowed them up. He stood there, stunned, the echo of what he'd just seen reverberating in his mind. Richard's empty, unfulfilling life despite his wealth. He spots Emma and James, igniting memories and regrets. Richard couldn't board that plane. Not now. He made his way to the airport's exit, his mind racing with questions. As he hailed a taxi, he took out his phone and dialed an old number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Tony Harris Investigations." The voice said. "Tony, it's Richard," he replied, breathless. "I need your help, now." Well, the prodigal son returns," Tony chuckled. "What could a man of your stature possibly need from an old detective like me?" "It's Emma," Richard blurted out. I think I saw her. She had a boy with her about 10 years old. He looks just like me, Tony. I need to know everything. Where she's living, who she's with, everything." "Whoa, slow down," Tony interrupted. "This is going to take some time. You sure you want to dig this up?" "I have to," Richard insisted. "Please." "All right," Tony sighed. "I'll see what I can find." Richard leaned back in the taxi, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had to know if that boy was his son, and if he was, Richard needed to understand why Emma never told him. Richard's curiosity and longing are sparked by seeing Emma and James. He cancels his flight and hires Tony to find them, starting his journey back to his past. At a small, 2-bedroom bungalow in suburban Chicago, Emma Carter stood at the kitchen counter, flipping pancakes while humming a soft tune. The smell of syrup and butter filled the room, and she glanced over at James, who sat at the table drawing in his notebook. "Mom, how do you spell explorer?" James asked, not looking up from his work. "Explorer," Emma answered, smiling. She watched him scribble the letters, her heart swelling with love and pride. There was so much of Richard in him, the blonde hair, the bright green eyes, the way he scrunched his nose when he was concentrating. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Ben standing there, holding a cup of coffee in one hand and a smile on his face. "Morning," Ben greeted, leaning in for a kiss. "How's my favorite teacher and her young scholar?" "Hungry," Emma laughed, letting him in. She watched as Ben and James exchanged a high five, the ease and warmth between them always tugging at her heart. But even as they laughed and ate together, Emma felt a shadow in her chest. A reminder of the man who wasn't there, who had walked away from this life they could have shared. Emma's morning routine shows her content life with James and Ben. Hints of unresolved pain about Richard are revealed, foreshadowing conflict. Richard's phone rang late that evening, pulling him from his thoughts. He answered quickly. "Tony?" "Yeah, it's me," Tony replied. "You're not gonna like what I found." "Tell me," Richard urged, heart pounding. "She's still in Chicago," Tony began, "living in a small house in the suburbs. But here's the kicker. She's got a kid, all right? A boy named James, 10 years old. And from what I dug up, there's no mention of a father on any of the school records. But there is a guy in the picture, Ben Thompson. Seems to be playing dad." The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. She's with someone else?" "Looks that way," Tony confirmed. "And from what I can tell, they're serious. He's been in her life for a few years now." Richard couldn't speak. All he could think about was that boy. The boy who looked just like him. "Thanks, Tony," he managed to say before hanging up. He sat there in the silence of his luxury penthouse, staring out at the Chicago skyline. For the first time in years, Richard felt the full weight of what he had lost. Tony confirms that James is likely Richard's son. Richard feels guilt and resolves to see Emma again, deepening his determination. The next afternoon, Richard drove to Maple Street Park, the location Tony had mentioned where Emma often took James. He spotted them almost immediately. Emma sat on a bench, watching James kick a soccer ball around with his friends. Next to her sat Ben, and they looked so comfortable together, like a real family. Richard's heart twisted with jealousy and regret. That could have been him sitting there, watching his son grow up, being part of his life. But he had chosen ambition over family, and now he was left with the consequences. He leaned against a tree, watching as James ran toward the goal, scoring and throwing his arms up in victory. The boy's joy was infectious, and for a brief moment, Richard felt a pang of hope. Suddenly, Emma's eyes met his from across the park. Her expression shifted from surprise to shock and then to something colder. She turned to Ben, whispering something, and Richard saw Ben nod before getting up to join James. Richard took a deep breath, then stepped forward. He wasn't going to run this time. "Emma," he called out as he approached. "It's been a long time." Her eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and pain. "What are you doing here, Richard?" "I needed to see you," he admitted. "To see him?" "You have no right." Emma began, but her voice cracked, and she took a shaky breath. "You have no right to be here." "I know," Richard said softly, "but I want to make things right." Emma shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "You can't just walk back into our lives after all this time." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Richard replied, "but I need to try." She looked at him for a long moment, as if searching for some sign that he'd changed, that he wasn't the man who walked away. "You want to make things right?" she said finally. "Then stay away." With that, she turned and walked back to James and Ben, leaving Richard standing alone. He watched them for a moment longer, feeling the full weight of her words. But instead of giving up, Richard felt a flicker of determination ignite within him. He wasn't done yet. Richard watches James with Ben, feeling jealous and regretful. He decides to approach Emma. The sun was high in the sky as Emma stood in her front yard, tending to the small flower garden she'd planted with James last spring. She had always found peace in these moments, away from the demands of work and the world outside. But today, that peace was shattered when she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. "Emma," a voice called out softly. She froze, recognizing it instantly. Turning around, she saw Richard standing at the edge of her driveway, his eyes locked on her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "What are you doing here?" Emma demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "I had to see you," Richard replied, taking a hesitant step forward. "To explain, to—" "There's nothing to explain," Emma interrupted, her heart pounding in her chest. "You left. 10 years, Richard. You don't get to just show up now." "I know," he said, swallowing hard. "And I regret it every single day. But that boy, James, he's my son, isn't he?" Emma's eyes filled with tears and she shook her head. "You don't have the right to ask that." "Please, Emma," Richard pleaded, his voice raw. "I just want a chance to make things right." "You had your chance," she snapped, stepping back. "You chose to walk away." "Emma, Leave," she demanded, "before I call the police." Richard stood there helpless, watching as Emma turned her back on him and walked inside, slamming the door behind her. Richard's decision to confront Emma. Emma's emotions are stirred, reopening old wounds. Emma was still shaking when she closed the door, trying to regain her composure. She didn't notice Ben's car pulling up until he entered the house, his smile fading the moment he saw her face. "Emma, what's wrong?" Ben asked, concern etching his features. She didn't want to say it. She didn't want to face the truth that had been knocking at her door. But there was no hiding it now. Richard was here. "Richard?" Ben repeated, his tone hardening. "What did he want?" "To see James," Emma replied, wrapping her arms around herself. He knows." Ben took a step closer, his eyes flashing with anger. "After all this time, he just shows up and thinks he can waltz back into your life?" "I don't know what he thinks," Emma said, her voice breaking. "But I told him to leave." Ben pulled her into his arms, his embrace warm and comforting. "He's not going to take you away from us, Emma." "I won't let him." She nodded, burying her face in his shoulder. But even as she stood there, held by the man who'd been her rock for years, she couldn't shake the feeling that Richard's return had changed everything. Richard's arrival disrupts Emma's life. Ben becomes protective, establishing himself as Richard's rival. Back in his penthouse, Richard sat in the dimly lit living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He stared out at the Chicago skyline, the memories of his past with Emma rushing back with a painful clarity. He remembered the night he had left her, the way she'd looked so peaceful, sleeping in their bed, completely unaware of the storm that was about to tear her world apart. He'd stood over her for what felt like hours, the weight of his decision pressing down on him, but the promise of wealth and success had been too tempting. "You deserve more, Richard," Vanessa had whispered in his ear that night, her hand resting on his chest. "With me, you can have everything you've ever wanted." He'd believed her, and for 10 years, he had lived the life he thought he wanted. But now, as he sat alone in his luxurious penthouse, he realized how hollow it all was. He'd lost the one thing that truly mattered, and no amount of money could ever bring it back. Richard reached for his phone, hesitating before dialing Tony's number. "Tony, it's me," he said when his friend answered. "I need you to find out everything you can about Emma and James." "You sure about this?" Tony asked. "Digging into this might just make things worse." "I don't care," Richard replied, determination hardening his voice. "I need to know. I need to make it right." Confrontation with Ben forces Richard to reflect on his past behavior. Richard resolves to be honest with Emma, pushing him to try again. That evening, Emma sat on the couch, her mind swirling with memories and emotions. Ben sat beside her, his hand resting on her knee, but she felt miles away. "Talk to me," Ben urged gently. "What's going on in that head of yours?" Emma sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know. I thought I'd moved on, but seeing him again, it brought everything back." "He doesn't deserve a place in your life," Ben said firmly. "Not after what he did." "I know," Emma whispered. "But he's James's father, and no matter how much I want to, I can't just erase him." Ben's jaw tightened. "And what about us? Where do we stand in all this?" Emma looked at him, her heart aching. "I love you, Ben. You've been there for me. For James, in a way Richard never was. But I can't just ignore this." "So what are you going to do?" Ben asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "I don't know," she admitted, tears welling up in her eyes, "but I need to find out." Richard's unexpected return forces Emma to confront her unresolved feelings. Cracks appear in Emma and Ben's relationship, adding to the conflict. The next morning, Richard sat at his desk, staring at a blank piece of paper. He had never been one for words, but now he needed them more than ever. With a deep breath, he picked up his pen and began to write. "Emma, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. I made choices that tore us apart, and I live with that regret every single day. But seeing you again, seeing James, I realize now just how much I've lost. How much I've taken from you both. I can't change the past, but I want to be part of the future if you'll let me. I want to know my son. I want to know the woman you've become. And maybe in time, you'll see that I'm not the man I used to be. Please, just give me a chance to make things right. Richard." He folded the letter carefully, his hands shaking, and drove to Emma's house. For a moment, he stood at her doorstep, hesitating. Then he placed the envelope on the doormat and walked away, his heart heavy but hopeful. Later that afternoon, Emma found the letter. She stood on the porch, reading Richard's words, tears streaming down her face. Her heart ached with every sentence, and she felt the stirrings of emotions she thought she had buried long ago. She looked out toward the street, half expecting to see him standing there. But there was only silence. With trembling hands, she folded the letter and took it inside, her mind whirling with possibilities she hadn't dared to consider before. Richard's growing need to express his remorse. Emma is faced with the decision to read the letter. Richard stood at the edge of Maple Street Park, his eyes drawn to the soccer field where a group of boys were running back and forth. Among them was James, laughing and calling out to his teammates, his blonde hair catching the sunlight. Richard's heart clenched. It was like looking into a mirror of his own childhood. Taking a deep breath, Richard approached the field, feeling like an intruder in a life he should have been a part of. As James took a break, Richard mustered the courage to approach him. "Nice game," Richard said, his voice tinged with nervousness. James looked up, eyes bright and curious. "Thanks. Do I know you?" Richard's throat tightened. "No, not really. I'm just a friend of your mom's." James studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "Cool. I like soccer." "So did I when I was your age," Richard replied, offering a small smile. "You've got some great moves." "Thanks," James beamed, then paused. "You look familiar." "Maybe," Richard said, his voice catching. "I used to live around here a long time ago." "Oh," James said, nodding. "Maybe that's it." Richard wanted to stay, to keep talking, but he felt a pang of guilt. This was his son, but James didn't know it. And for now, that was how it had to be. "Well, I better let you get back to your game," Richard said, backing away. "Okay," James replied, already turning back to his friends. "See you around." As Richard walked away, he felt a spark of hope mingled with regret. It was a small start, but at least he had made a connection. Richard's longing to connect with his son. A seed of curiosity is planted in James, though he doesn't realize who Richard is. Back at home, Emma sat on the couch, staring at Richard's letter, her hands trembling. She had read it 3 times already, each word chipping away at the wall she had built around her heart. "Mom?" James called, walking into the living room. "Is everything okay?" Emma quickly folded the letter, forcing a smile. "Yes, honey, everything's fine." James studied her with those green eyes that mirrored his father's. "You sure? You seem sad." Emma's heart ached. "I'm just thinking about someone from my past." "Who?" James asked, curiosity shining in his eyes. Emma hesitated, the truth on the tip of her tongue. "An old friend. Maybe they'll come back," James said thoughtfully. "Sometimes people come back, right?" Emma nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Maybe." Emma's curiosity and unresolved feelings. She agrees to meet Richard, propelling the story forward. Emma sat at a small cafe, her fingers wrapped around a warm cup of coffee. She stared out the window, heart racing as she waited. When the bell above the door chimed, she knew it was him. Richard approached her table, looking hesitant. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I had to," Emma replied, her tone guarded. "I need answers, Richard. Why now?" After all this time, Richard sat down, his eyes never leaving hers. "Because I realized what I lost. I realized that everything I thought I wanted, it means nothing without you and James." "You don't get to say that," Emma said, her voice shaking. "You left. You made that choice." "I know," Richard whispered, leaning forward, "and it was the worst decision of my life. I was selfish, Emma. I was chasing a dream that wasn't real, and I lost the only real thing I ever had." Tears welled up in Emma's eyes. "You didn't just leave me, Richard. You left him. You left your son." "I know," Richard replied, his voice breaking. "And I'll never forgive myself for that, but I want to try to make things right. Please, just give me a chance." Emma looked away, the pain too raw. "I don't know if I can." "Just think about it," Richard pleaded. "That's all I'm asking." Emma nodded, wiping away a tear. "I'll think about it." Richard's desire to make amends. Emma is conflicted, realizing he may be genuine, but still protective of her heart. That evening, Ben arrived home, noticing how distant Emma seemed. "Is everything okay?" he asked, sitting next to her on the couch. Emma sighed, avoiding his gaze. "I met Richard today." Ben's face tightened. "Why?" "Because I needed to," Emma replied softly. "He wants to be a part of James's life." "And what do you want?" Ben asked, his tone sharper than he intended. "I don't know," Emma admitted. "I never thought I'd have to face this." Ben stood, running a hand through his hair. "Do you still love him?" Emma looked up, startled. I love you, Ben. But Richard, he's James's father. He's part of this, whether we like it or not. I can't compete with a ghost, Emma, Ben said, his voice strained. I've been here every day, and now he just shows up, and suddenly you're different. I'm not different, Emma insisted. I'm just confused. Well, figure it out, Ben said, heading toward the door, because I don't know how much more of this I can take. Emma's emotional reaction to Richard's apology. Ben feels threatened, which heightens the tension. Richard stood in his penthouse, gazing at the city lights when his phone rang. It was Tony. I've got news, Tony said. Emma hasn't moved on emotionally. She's torn. You still have a chance. Richard closed his eyes, relief and hope flooding him. Thank you, Tony. I needed to hear that. There's more. Tony continued. Vanessa's been asking questions about you. You need to be careful. Richard's jaw tightened. I'll deal with her later. Right now, all that matters is Emma and James. After hanging up, Richard stared out at the skyline, determination burning in his chest. He wasn't going to let his past mistakes define his future. He would fight for his family, no matter the cost. Tony's report reinforces Richard's hope. Richard plans to confront Emma again. Richard stared out the window of his penthouse, lost in thought, when the door slammed open and Vanessa stormed in, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Her eyes were cold and furious as she crossed the room, tossing a folder onto the table. What is this? She demanded. Richard glanced at the folder, recognizing the documents inside. You've been spying on me? Don't act surprised, Vanessa snapped. You thought I wouldn't notice you sneaking off to meet her? Your little ex-wife and that boy? He's my son, Richard replied, his voice steady but firm. Your son? Vanessa scoffed. And what about us? What about everything we've built together? You're going to throw it all away for a woman who barely remembers you. It's not about you, Vanessa, Richard said, frustration bubbling up. It's about making things right with my family. Vanessa took a step closer, her voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. If you walk away from me, I will ruin you. I'll expose everything. All the deals, all the secrets. You'll lose everything. Richard met her gaze, unflinching. If that's what it takes, then so be it. You'll regret this, Vanessa spat, turning on her heel and storming out, leaving Richard to face the truth. The battle for his family had just become much more complicated. Vanessa's fear of losing her lifestyle. Richard faces a new obstacle, raising the stakes. Later that evening, Richard knocked on the door of Emma's modest home. She opened it cautiously, her eyes widening in surprise. What are you doing here? She asked. I need to talk to you, Richard replied, his tone softer. About James. Emma hesitated but stepped aside, allowing him in. Go on. I want to be part of his life, Richard said earnestly. I know I've made mistakes, and I know I have no right to ask this, but he's my son, Emma. I want to get to know him. Emma crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. And what happens when you get bored, Richard? When you realize that being a father isn't as glamorous as the life you left us for? I won't leave again, he vowed. I'm not that man anymore. Emma stared at him for a long moment, searching his eyes. All right, she said finally. You can see him. But if you hurt him, if you make one false move, I will cut you out of our lives forever. Do you understand? I do, Richard promised, relief flooding him. Thank you. As Emma walked him to the door, she paused. This doesn't mean I forgive you. I know, Richard replied, but it's a start. Richard's persistence and sincerity. Emma gives him a chance, but with conditions. A few days later, Richard found himself back at Maple Street Park, watching as James kicked a soccer ball around. Richard approached slowly, still nervous about intruding on his son's life. Hey, James, he called out. Mind if I join you? James looked up, squinting. You again? Yeah, Richard said with a smile. Thought I'd show you a few tricks. I used to be pretty good at this. Really? James challenged, kicking the ball toward him. Let's see what you got. They played for nearly an hour, and as they did, Richard felt something shift. They laughed, they teased, and for the first time, Richard felt like he was truly connecting with his son. Emma stood at a distance, watching, her heart torn between hope and fear. You're pretty good, James admitted out of breath as they sat on the grass. Thanks, Richard replied, smiling. You've got a lot of talent yourself. James looked at him curiously. You really knew my mom before? Yeah, Richard said quietly. A long time ago. Why did you leave? James asked, his voice small and Richard's heart twisted. Because I was scared, Richard admitted, and I made a terrible mistake. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Promise? James asked. Promise, Richard replied, and for the first time he felt like he was beginning to keep it. Richard's genuine effort to connect with James. The bond between father and son starts to grow. In her sprawling mansion, Vanessa paced back and forth, her fingers drumming against her phone. She dialed a number and waited impatiently. Mr. Reynolds, she said when the voice answered. I need you to dig deeper into Richard's finances. Find anything that can be used against him. Illegal deals, tax evasion, whatever you can get your hands on. I'll see what I can do, the investigator replied. And make it quick, Vanessa snapped. I want him back under my control before he does something stupid. She hung up and looked out at her perfectly manicured garden, a smile tugging at her lips. If Richard thought he could just walk away, he was about to find out how wrong he was. Vanessa's desperation to maintain control. Richard's past is about to catch up with him, threatening everything. Back at her home, Emma sat with Ben at the kitchen table. The tension was palpable, and she knew the moment had come to tell him the truth. Ben, there's something I need to tell you, Emma began, her voice shaky. I've been letting Richard see James. Ben's face tightened, and he set his cup down with a clatter. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was afraid, Emma confessed. Afraid of how you'd react, afraid of what it might mean. Do you still love him? Ben asked, his voice low. Emma's eyes filled with tears. I don't know, but he's James's father, and I can't deny him the chance to know his son. What about us? Ben demanded. Where do we fit into all of this? I love you, Ben, Emma whispered, but I don't know how to untangle all of this. I don't know how to make it right. Ben stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I need some time, Emma. I can't do this right now. He left the house, leaving Emma alone with her thoughts and the weight of the choices she'd made. Emma's honesty about her complicated emotions, Ben questions his role in their lives. James was in his room, drawing in his notebook when he heard raised voices coming from the living room. He tried to ignore them, but something about the tone made him pause. His mother never argued like this, especially not with Ben. Creeping toward the door, he could hear them more clearly. You're letting him see James? Ben's voice was incredulous, tinged with hurt. He's his father, Ben, Emma responded, her voice trembling. He deserves a chance to know him. He left you. He left both of you. Ben's anger was palpable. How can you even consider letting him back into your life? Because it's not about me, Emma retorted, tears brimming in her eyes. It's about what's best for James. The words hit James like a punch to the gut. Richard, his father? He backed away, his mind reeling, and before he knew it, he was out the front door, running as fast as he could, trying to escape the truth that had shattered his world. Emma and Ben's conflict over Richard. James's world is turned upside down, and he feels betrayed. Panic settled in as Emma realized James was gone. She and Ben scoured the neighborhood, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. Frantic, she called Richard. What's wrong? Richard asked, his voice immediately tense. It's James, Emma said, tears streaming down her face. He overheard us arguing. He knows you're his father, and now he's gone. I'm on my way, Richard replied, already grabbing his keys. As they searched the city together, Richard and Emma moved as a unit, their shared fear for James uniting them in a way they hadn't felt in years. He's out there somewhere, Richard murmured as they paused to catch their breath. And I won't stop until I find him. Emma looked at him, her heart aching. Thank you. For a moment, the years between them seemed to vanish, and Richard reached out, brushing a tear from her cheek. We'll find him, Emma. I promise. James's disappearance. Richard and Emma bond over their shared fear, deepening their connection. Richard's phone buzzed just as they resumed their search. It was Vanessa. He answered reluctantly. Where are you? She demanded, her voice sharp. You've been avoiding me. Now's not the time, Vanessa, Richard snapped. My son is missing. Oh, so you care about him now? She sneered. You think you can just waltz back into their lives and play the hero? I'm not playing, Richard growled. This is my family. You can't control me anymore. Oh, but I can, Vanessa replied, her voice turning icy. I know all about your little illegal business deals, Richard. If you don't come back to me, I'll make sure the world knows too. You'll lose everything. Richard's heart sank. He had been expecting this, but it didn't make it any easier. "Do what you have to do," he said, his voice calm. "But I'm not walking away from my family again." "You'll regret this," Vanessa hissed before hanging up. Richard closed his eyes, letting out a shaky breath. "I'm done with her," he muttered. "It's time I face the consequences of my actions." Vanessa's desperate attempt to keep control. Richard decides to confess his crimes. Richard spotted a familiar figure sitting alone on a park bench. It was James, huddled up with his arms around his knees, staring at the ground. Richard's heart skipped a beat as he approached, taking a seat beside him. "Hey," Richard said softly. "Mind if I join you?" James didn't respond, his eyes red from crying. "You're my dad," he finally whispered. "Yes," Richard admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I am." "Why didn't you want me?" James asked, his voice breaking. "Why did you leave?" Richard felt tears prick his eyes. "I was scared, James. I was selfish, and I made terrible choices. But none of it was because I didn't want you. You have no idea how much I've regretted leaving. I wish I could go back and change everything, but I can't." James was silent for a moment, then looked up at him. "Are you going to leave again?" "No," Richard said firmly. "Never again. I'm here to stay if you'll let me." James wiped his eyes with his sleeve. "I don't know if I can trust you." "I understand," Richard replied, his heart aching. "But I'll do everything I can to prove that you can." "Okay," James whispered, and for the first time he leaned into Richard's side, seeking comfort. Richard wrapped an arm around him, holding his son close, and felt a glimmer of hope. Richard's determination to make things right. James agrees to give Richard a chance, but it's tentative. Richard and James returned to Emma's house where she stood waiting on the porch, her face etched with worry. The moment she saw them, relief washed over her, and she rushed forward, wrapping James in a hug. "Don't ever do that again," she scolded gently, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, Mom," James mumbled. I had to know." Emma nodded, looking up at Richard, gratitude mingling with something else in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Richard took a deep breath. "There's something I need to tell you, both of you." He led them inside and confessed everything, the illegal business deals, the lies, and the choices that had led him to this point. "I'm going to turn myself in," he said quietly. "It's the only way to make things right." Emma stared at him, stunned. "You'll lose everything." "I already have," Richard replied. "But I can't keep living a lie." "Not anymore." James reached out, taking his hand. "Will you still be my dad?" "Always," Richard promised, his voice choked with emotion. "No matter what happens." Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. "You've changed," she said softly. Maybe there's hope for us all." The three of them sat together, holding on to each other, as the weight of the past finally began to lift. For the first time in a long time, Richard felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Richard's resolve to face his past. Emma realizes Richard has truly changed. Richard stood in the center of the courtroom, his hands trembling slightly as the judge read the charges against him. He glanced over his shoulder, and there, sitting in the gallery, were Emma, James, and even Ben. Their presence gave him strength, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. "All rise," the judge announced. "Richard Graham, you have pleaded guilty to all charges. Before I pass sentence, do you have anything to say?" Richard took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Your Honor, I have spent most of my life chasing wealth, power, and ambition, and in the process I lost everything that truly mattered. I abandoned my family, lied to the people I loved, and made choices that hurt others. But today, I stand here ready to face the consequences of my actions. I ask not for leniency, but for the chance to make things right." The judge regarded him for a moment before nodding. "Mr. Graham, you have shown remorse, and your willingness to admit your wrongdoings is commendable. However, actions have consequences, and you must face them. I hereby sentence you to 2 years in prison, order you to repay all profits gained through illegal means." Richard's shoulders sagged, but there was no anger, no bitterness, only acceptance. As he was led away, he glanced one last time at Emma and James, who smiled at him through their tears. And for the first time in a long while, Richard felt free. Richard's confession. Richard's fate is sealed, but he earns Emma and James's respect. Emma stood outside the prison entrance, clutching James's hand as they waited for Richard to appear. When the doors finally opened and Richard stepped out, he looked thinner, his hair grayer, but his eyes were brighter, more alive. "Dad!" James cried, breaking free of Emma's grip and running to him. Richard knelt, arms open wide, and caught James in a tight embrace. "You've grown so much," he whispered, tears in his eyes. "I'm so proud of you." James pulled back, his own eyes shining. "I've missed you, Dad." Richard glanced at Emma, who was watching them, with a soft smile. "Thank you for bringing him," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Emma nodded. "He needed to see you. We both did." They stood there for a moment, three people who had once been shattered, now piecing themselves back together. As they started to walk toward the car, Richard paused and looked back at the prison one last time. "It's over," he murmured. "I'm finally free." "Welcome home," Emma said, and for the first time, Richard felt like he had one. Richard's honesty and sacrifice. A bond is formed, despite the separation. The day of Emma and Ben's wedding was bright and sunny, with just a hint of a breeze in the air. Richard stood at the back of the small garden where the ceremony was taking place, his heart swelling with pride as he watched James walk down the aisle as the ring-bearer. Emma appeared, radiant in her simple white dress, and Richard felt a pang of bittersweet happiness. She was moving on, building a life that he could never be part of in the way he once was. And yet, he felt no jealousy, no regret. Only gratitude for the chance to witness this moment. As Emma reached the altar and took Ben's hand, she glanced back at Richard, who offered her a small, encouraging nod. And in that instant, Emma knew that despite everything, they would always be connected. "Thank you," she whispered to him later at the reception. "For what?" Richard asked, genuinely surprised. "For letting me go," Emma replied, her eyes shining. "For finally letting us both move on." Richard smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "You deserve all the happiness in the world, Emma." "And so do you," she replied. Emma and Ben's dedication to each other. Emma finally feels at peace. 2 years passed, and the day Richard was released from prison, Emma and James were there waiting. They stood by the gates, waving as he walked toward them. Scrice, and Richard felt a swell of emotion so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. "Welcome back," Emma said, smiling. "Thanks," Richard replied, pulling her into a hug. "For everything." James grinned up at him, clutching a soccer ball. "Think you can still keep up with me, old man?" Richard laughed, ruffling his son's hair. "You bet I can." They drove to a modest apartment Richard had rented, far removed from the luxury he once lived in. There was no wealth, no power, but there was love, and that was more than enough. As they entered the apartment, Richard felt a sense of belonging he had never known before. He was home, Richard's journey to redemption. They walk out together, ready to rebuild. It was a warm Sunday afternoon, and Richard, Emma, Ben, and James stood together on the sidelines of a soccer field watching James play. The sun cast a golden glow over the park, and the sound of children's laughter filled the air. "Go, James!" Richard cheered, clapping as his son dribbled the ball past an opponent. "He's really gotten good," Ben remarked, giving Richard a friendly nod. "Yeah," Richard agreed, his heart swelling with pride. "He's amazing." Emma glanced at the two men and smiled. They were not a perfect family, but they were a family nonetheless, one that had fought hard for this moment. As James scored the winning goal, his teammates lifted him on their shoulders, and he looked over at Richard, grinning from ear to ear. "Dad, did you see that?" "I saw it," Richard called back, tears in his eyes. "I'm so proud of you." And in that moment, with Emma by his side, James's cheers echoing in the air, and Ben offering him a handshake, Richard knew that despite all the mistakes, all the pain, he had finally found what he'd been searching for all along. He was finally home, their shared struggles and love. The story closes with hope as they face the future together. The story ends with a sense of fulfillment, redemption, and hope. Richard's journey has come full circle, and while he cannot change his past, he has learned to embrace the present and the love of his family.